Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Dr. Kiki's Science Hour is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Dr. Kiki's Science Hour with Dr. Kiki Sanford, episode number 69, recorded on Thursday, October 19th, 2010. Let's talk about fish feelings. Good afternoon. This is Dr. Kiki's Science Hour, and I am Dr. Kiki. Welcome to episode 69. Today on the show, we're going to be talking about whether or not fish have feelings. It's a controversial subject to some, might be surprisingly so to others, but the subject in all is really interesting. So, as usual, let's spend 1 hour digging into one subject with one expert, and the expert we're speaking with today is Dr. Victoria Braithwaite. She is the author of a book called Do Fish Feel Pain? She's also a professor of fisheries and biology, the School of Forest Resources at Pennsylvania State University. Her research investigates the evolution of animal cognition, focusing on fish learning, perception, and memory. She has advised the UK Government Animal Procedures Committee, has published numerous research articles, and has written for the media, including the LA Times. She's also been awarded the Fisheries Society of the British Isles Medal. And this year, the book that came out, Do Fish Feel Pain?, is the subject of our conversation today. Welcome, Victoria. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. I think this is just a fascinating issue. Historically, it doesn't seem to be a question that people have really asked. Is that an appropriate assessment of the situation?
Yes, it's quite amazing, really. I mean, that is quite accurate. It seems amazing in many ways that it's taken us so long to ask what is really quite a basic biological question. You know, fish are vertebrates, so they're quite closely related to us in terms of thinking comparatively across the animal kingdom. So why is such a basic fact something that we haven't really addressed before or really asked before? And I think that was something that really took my colleagues and I by surprise when we started to investigate this in the early 90s. We really had anticipated that some of the basic understanding of the nervous system associated with pain perception in fish would really be there, and we would be doing some sort of icing on top, if you like, in terms of the research that we would do. But the opposite was true. We had to go right back to the beginning and ask these very basic questions about whether fish even have appropriate nerve fibers and receptors that actually detect painful stimuli.
And there was a study that came out, I think, within the last year that basically said, yes, they have these receptors, right?
That's right. No, so that work was work that we published in 2003.
Okay.
So it's about 7 years old now. The original work that showed that they do indeed have these specialized pain receptors and then nerve fibers that transmit that information up to the brain.
Okay, so they've got the wiring. They should be able to feel pain.
That's right. But it's a little bit harder than that because pain is actually a two-stage process. So the initial stage is a reflexive response, and you can think about this in terms of if you were to pick up something hot, your initial reaction is to drop that. And you do that subconsciously. You're not even thinking about what you do when you drop the hot thing. And that's
right.
Because your nervous system and the protective processes that are there to detect the pain are doing all of that at the level of the spine. It hasn't gone up to the brain at that point. But then in us and other animals that do feel pain, a second process kicks in, and that's the stage at which the signal passes up to the brain. It's then processed in a number of different regions, and that's when you become consciously aware something's hurting you, you've damaged yourself, you know, you've hurt your hand, and so forth.
Yeah, that's when the ow response happens.
Exactly, exactly, and that's something that so in addition to having that wiring and so forth, you then need to ask this question, well, do fish do that second bit? Do they do this feeling of pain? That they're responding to the emotions and the hurt that is associated with the tissue damage that's going on. So it gets quite tricky at that point, because you have to show that it's more than just this reflexive response. And that's not easy, because to get at that, you're really having to get inside the mind of the animal. And that's hard for any animal, but with fish, it really isn't very straightforward.
Why is it not so straightforward? Just because you can't talk to them?
Well, that's right. And I mean, in the same way, with a mammal, for example, you might expect it to whimper or to withdraw its paw if you've hurt a limb or something. With fish with fins, it's a little bit difficult to sort of look at some of those responses. So we ended up choosing to look at something like how much attention the fish were able to pay to an object in their environment, something novel that we put into the environment that they typically would show an avoidance response towards. And by treating the fish in a way that we believed was going to produce a pain response, we then looked at how those fish changed their behavior towards this novel object. And what we were looking for here was whether we could show that the pain the fish were experiencing or potentially experiencing was distracting their ability to pay attention to that object. So we were sort of trying to make a cognitive link there, if you like. The idea being that to pay attention to the object, the fish would have to be aware of its presence, aware of where they were in relation to the object and so forth, and being able to show this normal avoidance response. And what we found was that when we did treat the fish with chemicals and venom that we assumed would be producing a pain-type response, this ability to avoid that object and pay attention to it in the way that they normally would was impaired. Now, if that's genuinely to do with the pain that they're feeling, we ought to be able to reinstate that normal avoidance and cognitive awareness by providing pain relief. So we repeated the experiment, and the second time we did it, we provided the fish with a small amount of morphine. And what we then saw was that this normal avoidance response and the normal attention resumed. So quite compelling evidence, we think, that the response that the fish are producing goes beyond that spinal reflex. They're actually showing something at the brain level as well.
Right. The fact that it actually impairs their attention and their ability to interact with things in the environment that they would normally, that it would impair their normal reactions.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
That is quite interesting. Did you see anything? Did you look at like group behavior or involvement of individual fish with other fish?
No. So our work particularly focused just on individuals. Okay. So we wanted to look at how those individuals were responding. But others have subsequently gone on and looked at some aspects associated with social changes and social responses. And again, some interesting differences come out there in terms of the dynamics of individuals. If they're very dominant, aggressive individuals, they appear to try to suppress this distraction that the pain gives them, whereas more subordinate individuals seem to be more sensitive towards the pain response and so forth. So there's kind of interesting changes and dynamics come out there. And again, that kind of mirrors what we might expect from other behavior studies, where, if you are a dominant individual and you need to stay in charge of a territory or what have you, you might have to be prepared to fight that pain a little bit in order to hang on to the territory that you're defending.
There's a lot of complex interactions that are going on there in those situations, aren't there?
Definitely.
Yeah. So what got you interested in this question in the first place in terms of fish?
That's a very good question. We really many people think that we started to look at this because we were curious about angling and the question of welfare in angling. That wasn't the motivation at all. In fact, our motivation was much more based with farming. We were interested from an aquaculture perspective what the consequences are of farming fish, keeping them in large numbers in environments that are really quite alien to what they would normally find themselves in, and to try and address that, that's what I mean. I was saying we were surprised at how far we had to go back to ask this simple question of, well, do fish have this capacity to suffer or not? So it was very much in mind with the sort of the fact that the aquaculture industry is growing hugely and will continue to do so. This is a main way in which we're going to continue to produce fish for consumption, for human consumption. So given the fact that it's an expanding, very large industry, what kind of policy do we need in place to make sure that the welfare of those fish is appropriately managed? And, indeed, is it even a meaningful question to be talking about fish welfare? So that was kind of where it started.
Yeah, it seems like an interesting place to start, especially from the perspective of so many people, fishermen and others who probably just have fish live in schools. Fish, they probably don't care, whatever. They're just fish. Put them in a big tank, grow them, and then suddenly we start to have these realizations.
So I think there's a lot of preconceived ideas out there about, as you say, fish. So and
not just fish, probably many other animals as well, lizards or things that we don't really connect with as mammalian.
That's exactly right, and I think that's a real problem that fish have had in many ways. They live in this alien environment. They suffocate in air. They need to be underwater. Mm-hmm. They behave in ways that we're beginning to try and understand now, but it's taken us a long time to understand that, actually anything complex could happen. And it doesn't help by the fact that there are these urban myths that, fish have a 3-second memory and so on and so forth. It doesn't really lend itself to a sort of they're not cute, cuddly animals. They're not furry. They're not feathery. So they have a hard time in terms of trying to get public sympathy, if you like. But I think from a sort of welfare argument point of view, what we need to be concerned about is, well, does the animal have a capacity to suffer? Mm-hmm. And that's what it boils down to. So if we can show through experiments and through behavior work that indeed fish are sentient, they have this capacity for feeling, then at some level, albeit very differently to how you or I might feel and suffer, they have some capacity for perceptions of suffering and fear. And I think if that is the case, then from a welfare perspective, we need to consider what we can do to minimize that.
Right. In the aquaculture situations, where there are large numbers of fish being grown in small areas, is it that they're being injured just being around the other fish? Is it the small? What are the issues at play there?
That's a good question. So at different stages of development, there are a number of different things that can occur. One of the main problems that we have with farmed fish is actually fin damage. So, if you think about going to a fish market, you can pretty readily tell which fish are wild and which are farmed just by looking at the quality of the fins. The farmed fish often have very stubby, eroded fins, and that's partly through scraping the fins along pens and rough sides, rough edges within the sea cages or sea pens where they've been kept. But it's also because the fish tend to be quite aggressive to one another when they're closely, or can be aggressive to one another. They're not always. And under some circumstances there, you find that they will actively choose to bite or lunge at the fins. Now, presumably that's because those are quite sensitive areas of the body. And indeed, very recent research has just shown that fins also have these specialized pain receptors present in them. So, so it probably makes sense that the fish have some understanding that lunging at a fin could, it'll hurt. Yeah. So that's probably why they direct their attention at those particular parts of the body. So fins can become damaged. Certainly flanks can also become eroded. If the skin is damaged, then that can open up infection possibilities and so forth. So there's a number of sort of physical kind of issues, physical trauma that can occur. And that will increase the more we handle the fish. And within aquaculture, it's a part of life. You have to handle the fish in order to grade them, to size them, to move them about from one location to another. So trying to devise ways or create ways in which you can minimize how much physical contact those fish then have with structures, it improves things. So more and more, we're trying to keep fish within bodies of water by pumping them through quite wide bore tubes, for example, so that the fish don't have to touch these hard physical surfaces, and that can help to minimize the amount of tissue damage that occurs.
Yeah. I'm wondering also the damage that occurs to the animals if it has long-term effects also. So if they're feeling pain, that might have short-term acute effects, certainly,
Yeah.
but then if there are other behavioral or other stress effects that would occur as a result of long-term chronic repeated insults.
Absolutely, and so just in the same way that we concern ourselves with terrestrial farm welfare in terms of chronic pain or chronic situations and the fact that it has detrimental effects on their health, fish are the same. Fish will experience the same kind of problems, and we can see this in terms of simple physiology and health. So a fish that is chronically either stressed or chronically in pain, these fish are not doing well, and long term do have. Absolutely. They're not growing as well. They're not putting the flesh on as well. The quality of the flesh that you're going to get from those fish is not good.
Right.
So for lots of reasons, it actually pays the fish farmer to be paying attention to these things.
Yeah, you're going to get a better fish out of a better welfare situation.
Absolutely, a better quality product. And and the other thing that I think is becoming increasingly the case, the consumer is also interested in that too. So the consumer wants to know the kind of quality of life that the organisms that we now harvest and consume. What's gone on there? Has that animal been well cared for or not? So as those questions become increasingly common. People who farm animals, whether it's terrestrial or within aquaculture, are interested in getting it right. And I would say that this is something that many corners of the aquaculture industry are doing well in. I would say that they're actually being quite proactive about it, which is it's quite refreshing to see, because for long enough it's been quite an uphill battle to get people to open their eyes in terms of terrestrial farming. The fish farmers are quite smart. They know that their fish, if they are, I don't really want to say it, but happy fish is one that is going to grow better and produce a better product, if you like.
Happy fish, happy California cows. They all have to be happy animals.
Well, yeah. So better well-being, better welfare, then the better the animal.
Right. In terms of the chronic stress situation, when you look at the animals physiologically, I'm just thinking of what we know of chronic stress in humans, chronic stress in primates. There's some great work by Sapolsky and other researchers who show real differences in stress hormones and the physiology of animals in different stress situations. Are those matched by fish? Is it the same profile?
It's very similar. It's very similar. So in the same way that we produce cortisol as our stress hormone, fish are producing cortisol as well. The actual physiological process is a little bit different in terms of the organs that are secreting and producing these different hormones. But broadly speaking, it's a vertebrate stress response. You can map it in the same way that you might map it for a bird or for a mammal. So physiologically speaking, yes, it's quite straightforward. We can go in and we can measure these the time course of different stress responses or the longevity of the different stress responses and so forth, and that can give us quite a good idea of how stressful a procedure is that the fish are actually experiencing. For example, how quickly they recover, how quickly their levels of cortisol drop back down to normal baseline levels. All these things can tell us about the experiences that the fish are going through and how they're perceiving those.
Okay. In terms of the research that you're doing, you're having to actually not injure, but give some kind of like you mentioned a chemical or some kind of a compound or something that will produce pain. Is this, as you find, as yourself and other researchers start finding that yes, indeed, fish feel pain, they have these stress responses that are on par with mammals, with other vertebrates. Is this going to affect your animal reviews for future research? Will it make it more difficult to do these sorts of studies?
So that's a good point. And actually, among my colleagues in the research world, so not other people who might be interested in the outcome of this research, but actually within research, there were quite a lot of concerned people when we started doing this work in terms of, well, how's this going to affect the research that we do?
Yeah.
But I think in the same way that we're concerned about the mouse, the mouse house, or the rats that we use in experiments, if you want to get good behavioral data from those animals, you need to know that you're treating them in ways that are not harming or disturbing or causing abnormal behavior. Mm-hmm. So to actually understand the stress responses or the pain responses in the animal that you're working with has to be a good thing, because if you understand those, you're going to get a much better appreciation of when the animal is behaving normally versus when it's actually abnormal, or it's in pain, or it's showing you some odd kind of response.
Right.
So I think in terms of those of us working on fish behavior and trying to understand how behavior might change under different circumstances and so forth, you really want to have an understanding of what normal is, and in order to understand normal, you have to understand what the abnormal side is. So I think while there was some concern about it initially, I would say most of that's been quelled now. And I think actually, the other thing is that it may have taken us a long time to ask this question about whether fish feel pain, but those who have been legislating about, for protection of animals in research or laboratory use of organisms and so forth, fish have actually always been in there. So fish have been protected. So I guess what we're doing is kind of reaffirming that, yes, they should be in there. But it's not as though we've had ability to treat fish in the same way that at the moment invertebrates can be treated, for example, where we don't have legislation and they're not protected. Yeah.
Right. Invertebrates get the short end of the stick for sure in this in the research world.
They do. Yes. Yes. You don't need permission to work on them. You don't need training. Yeah. They have you're right. It's the short end of the stick.
Yeah. In terms of the discoveries that have been made over the last 20 years, since the early 90s when you started working in this field, the general perception of fish and how they behave, and to now, from then to now, has it affected dramatically the way that you ask questions about the fish?
That's a good question. I think it has, because I would say that what we have learned over the last 10, 15 years is that fish are much more cognitively sophisticated than we've actually thought them capable of in the past. So, they are capable of making quite complex decisions. They're capable of integrating multiple pieces of information, weighing those different pieces of information up, and then, behaving in some appropriate way. Mm-hmm. Now, that's something that I think many people have found quite surprising. They've thought long and hard that, well, they've thought for a long time that fish are much more stimulus response creatures. Mm-hmm. But that simply isn't true. There are a lot of different species of fish, and so there's a lot of variation out there. But some species of fish are remarkably sophisticated in the kinds of behavior that they generate. In terms of communication, for example, in terms of the maps that they can generate and the shortcuts that they can take if they're threatened by a predator and so forth. So these things we're only just, well, it's taken us a while to realize how that we need to ask the questions in the right way. But having figured that out and figured that there are a number of ways in which you can ask appropriate questions, then we start to see that things are, fantastically more sophisticated than we ever dreamed of. So that's opening up all sorts of avenues of interesting research in its own right, just in terms of trying to understand how a relatively simple vertebrate brain can produce these sophisticated forms of behavior. That in itself is rather interesting.
Yeah, and it really gets to the question of, instinct versus, thought process. The actual,
That's right.
The area of actually cognitively understanding situations, making decisions, as opposed to just the instinct kicking in.
That's right. Yeah. And I could So one wonderful example, I mean, I kind of alluded to the fact that, you know, fish can communicate with one another. There is a remarkably interesting observation that came about from some work in the Red Sea between two different species of fish. One is the grouper, which is a fast-swimming predator that will outswim its prey and catch them that way. The other is the moray eel, which is, you know, much lither in its appearance and a much slower swimmer, and usually tries to track its prey down by creeping among the crevices in the coral reefs and so forth. Now, those are two different strategies for trying to capture prey. So, you know, wouldn't it be amazing if they actually came together? What a kind of formidable hunting team that would produce.
Yeah.
And incredibly enough, that's what the grouper and the moray eel do in the Red Sea. So there is some beautiful work that was done by Redouane Bachary and colleagues. He's from the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland. And he has shown that if the grouper is chasing after prey and it disappears into the coral reef, the grouper will swim off to the cave entrance of a moray eel, and it will signal to the eel that it wants help with the hunt. And it does this by very vigorously shaking its head in a sort of up-down fashion. And the eel is usually a little bit sluggish during the day because it's normally a nocturnal hunter. But if interested, you know, if its interest is piqued, it will come out, and then the two will swim off for, you know, several meters. I mean, 20, 30 meters down the reef and so forth, to the point where the grouper lost the fish. And then the grouper will signal where on the reef that the fish disappeared. And the moray eel will enter the reef at that point and start searching for the fish. Now, half the time, the fish is quite startled by this process, and so the prey fish, it'll dart out into the open water where the grouper is waiting to ambush it. But on the other half of the occasions, the moray eel is able to corner it within the reef, and so it also gets to eat, you know, on some of the times when it's doing this. So, you know, they share the spoils in this way, and so we've truly got some cooperative hunting here between two different species, and communication between these two different species that they understand, and, you know, there's intention there. The grouper is, you know, intending for the eel to come out and help it in the hunt and so forth. So, you know, this is fish we're talking about. So as I say, you know, this is relatively new work, and 5-6 years ago, people just wouldn't have contemplated that was possible.
No, I think it's still difficult to conceive of, but it's, you know, as the evidence grows of the complexity of communication and behavior between different species, it becomes more and more easy to actually accept it and understand that it is happening. It's just that to me, thinking about the forces at play that must have led to these two disparate species, like you said, who have different hunting styles but that can work in this particular situation together, how that would happen, it's fascinating.
It is. Who knows how it has evolved, but it has, and you know, and it seems to be quite a stable communication strategy, and it's very efficient and it works very well. So something that lots of animal societies, even very sophisticated animal societies, find difficult to achieve, this cooperative hunting, you know, we actually even see it in fish. So
yeah, and in terms of the cooperation, so we've got cooperation, we've got feeling pain, other cognitive other properties of cognition are memory. So cooperation, there has to be memory involved in there, memory of individuals, memories of between interactions with individuals over time. That sure plays against the 3-day fish memory, right? The goldfish that only can remember for 3. You know.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Well, some would even say it's seconds, not even days. So I think you're being generous. So. No, absolutely, and I think again that's something that's it's taken us a while to really understand this, but there's been some very elegant work coming out showing that there are specific areas within the fish forebrain which are developmentally very similar to regions that we have ourselves. So a hippocampus and an amygdala, those regions actually do exist within the fish brain. But it's taken us a long time to find those, and that's actually an interesting quirk associated with the development of the fish, the fish brain. So unlike ourselves, where things get inverted on each other during the development. So as the neural plate is developing, we see neurons moving in towards each other. So things that are originally on the outside begin to push into the middle, and that's where we find these structures in our own brains, in the mammalian brain. Within fish, the opposite happens. I don't understand why, but as I say, it's a quirk of development. So things that are actually on the edge get pushed out and around to the side. So areas that we naturally understand within our own brains that are associated with these complex learning and memory kind of task, which are towards the middle of our brains, are on the outside of the fish and towards the top.
That's similar to birds, where the hippocampus is on the top.
That's right. So now we know where to look. You can go in and you can do careful lesioning experiments and look at the deficits that you create when you impair that part of the brain. And you can show that they have regions which are dedicated, just like the hippocampus, to learning about sequences of things or episodes, so a timing of events, or to do with spatial memory. So you can cause changes in ability. The fish can swim through a maze before you do the lesion, and after the lesion, they have trouble navigating around. They have trouble understanding their way. And quite close to that region, there's also a region which is associated with emotion and emotional memory. And if you lesion that, you prevent the fish from learning fear avoidance, classic fear avoidance type tasks. So, again, it's taken us a while to really get to grips with what the fish brain is doing and how it's doing it. And in many cases, this tiny forebrain, because it does seem very small compared to the rest of the brain, we have large olfactory bulbs, large optic tector, and so forth. But this tiny forebrain is doing a lot. And so now that we have the skills and the understanding of where to go in and look, we can do quite refined experiments to get a much better understanding of how that is contributing to this complex behavior.
Yeah. What questions do you think are really pertinent right now and really interesting in terms of fish behavior?
Oh, that's a good one. So I think there's still quite a lot of question about this, what we mean by fish cognition, and particularly about affective state, actually. So that's something that we're beginning to really probe with mammals and birds, of trying to understand moods, if you like. So does the animal have an optimistic or a pessimistic outlook? Is that something we can actually get at? Because if you can show that by housing an animal in a particular way, you can actually promote optimism and promote good moods, then, just as we've been talking about before, that's a good thing. So where that work is naturally going at the moment is to ask, well, is that actually meaningful to ask those kinds of questions in fish? So we're just beginning to try and do those kinds of experiment now. They're tricky to get at, but it's an interesting challenge. It really is to try and answer those kinds of questions.
How are you doing that in the laboratory? Is it I'm sorry.
So it's quite tricky. Well, one of the things you can do is to try and look at disappointment, for example. So you can train an animal to expect to. I know it sounds silly.
It's the human terms, I think, are our terms for certain moods. Just to think of a disappointed fish. Oh, that's too bad. Maybe next time.
And we have to be careful when we anthropomorphize like this, but sometimes it's hard to explain this without using human terms. So one of the things you can do, for example, is to train a fish to approach a particular food bowl to obtain a certain reward. And let's say, you give it 6 worms, and you do this on a routine basis. So as the fish approaches the food bowl, it's expecting that 6 worms are going to be there. So on a number of trials, you can then downshift that reward so that you now just give it, say, 1. And you can look at the responses that animal makes and how it responds to this disappointment, because it's expecting 6, but 6 aren't there. So we can look for subtle differences in how quickly it approaches the bowl, the routes with which it tries to approach the bowl, and so forth, and look for changes in behavior associated with that disappointment. And I think the other thing that's we're trying to do at the moment, but it's still very early days, is to also look at how fish will generalize to a situation. So typically animals, or even humans who are in an optimistic state of mind, will much more readily generalize to a situation. So they'll risk things a little bit. That's similar enough to make me think that that's probably going to be rewarded, although it's a little bit different.
Right.
Whereas a pessimist would respond the opposite way. It's like, that is different to what I think it is, so I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to try that. So if you can generate a task where you can look at how readily or how willing the organism is to generalize towards something that might have been rewarded or non-rewarded in the past, you can start to tap into these ideas of is it in an optimistic mood, or is it actually feeling rather pessimistic right now? So,
does a fish have a bad day?
Well, actually, when you train these fish, yes, I think they do. there are days where you think, what are you thinking? But a fish that can be swimming through a maze extremely quickly, some days will have a bad day, and it can throw your experiment when that happens, and that's very frustrating.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. Have you looked much at the differences between different species in these similar tasks to see, are there, some fish who are just much better at these, or much more likely to feel disappointment or to have these generalizable moods?
So it's too early to say in terms of the mood side of things, because we're really just beginning to tap at that. But so it is a very interesting question. I mean, fish are hugely diverse. There are, believe it or not, 30,000 different species of fish. So a hugely diverse group. And with that comes a lot of variation in terms of behavior, complexity of behavior, brain morphology, just changes within how many different sensory systems the fish have, even, for example. So lots of variation out there. And with that variation, you would expect differences then between those different species in terms of how they're processing information, how relevant some things are or not. One of the things my group and I got very interested in about a decade ago was trying to understand within a species whether you might get differences in what fish are feeling as, recognizing as salient information or not. So, even within a species, can you see differences? Are there smart fish? Are there stupid fish? Depending on the situation, maybe they've been reared in, or, experiences that they've had. And actually, even within a species, you can see there are clear differences. So, for example, you can go and sample fish of the same species from different kinds of habitat. One of the things we do, for example, is look at how predation, the threat of predation, might change your ability to behave and make decisions. And so we can go and sample in the wild populations that are naturally exposed to high levels of predation pressure and populations that are living in areas with very few predators, and then compare the behavior of those fish. And something like predation pressure, or the threat of it, changes what those fish are paying attention to, how quickly they make decisions, how accurate they are, how quickly they will learn to solve particular spatial problems. So even within a species, you get differences, which is quite surprising, I think, in some ways.
But it puts a lot of evidence towards the idea of how important the environment is toward individual development.
Absolutely, yes. So the environment is really shaping things in these. And for something like predation, which is such a strong selective, it's unforgiving. If you get it wrong, that's it. It's your last decision. So, for something like predation pressure, you would expect fairly strong selection, to make you behave or respond appropriately in that particular environment. So where that's relaxed, you can afford to maybe take the more gambles, live life a little closer to the wind. Who knows? Yeah.
Yeah, this makes me think a little bit about the cichlids in African lakes. How there have been so many studies of the various species, subspecies of the cichlids, and their evolution in little pockets, shallow waters versus deep waters within the same lake with the same species, or their behaviors seem to be very, very triggered or molded by where they are,
by the local circumstance. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Or indeed what they specialize in terms of their feeding. And so forth, whether they're a scale feeder that's eating off the scales of other cichlids, or they're feeding down at the bottom in the detritus and so forth. Even those differences there will make a difference. And in fact, I was alluding to the fact that, we know that brains vary a lot between different fish species. Well, there was a very nice study done a few years ago now doing some comparative work of cichlid cichlid brains, and they're hugely variable. So very much depending on the kinds of sensory stimuli that would be relevant. As you get deeper in the lake, it gets darker, so vision becomes less important. Olfactory bulbs suddenly get bigger. The use of the lateral line changes depending on where you're living and whether you're schooling or not, or solitary. All those kinds of things have a big effect on the brain and the behavior of the fish.
In terms of your work and going back to the welfare, so we're learning, you're trying to understand more and more about how fish develop in their environments, how they interact with other fish, other organisms within their environment. From your work and your book specifically, what are you hoping will come out of it?
So I kind of need to go back a little bit and explain the motivation for writing the book, actually. So when we published this work that said fish have pain receptors, we were staggered at the media response, because in a way we thought this was such an obvious question, it really wasn't going to attract that much attention. But we were very wrong with that. And in fact, there was a media storm, and what the media picked up on was, well, if fish feel pain, then angling must be a painful process, and it must be cruel. And so almost overnight, actually, a lot of words were put into our mouths, a lot of extension of what we'd actually found was suddenly splashed over newspapers. And, we became hugely unpopular with the angling fraternity.
Overnight.
Overnight. And from that and from this media frenzy that happened, there was a lot of storytelling that went on, a lot of myth that was generated about what our results had actually shown. And, cyber chat rooms and internet chat rooms, magazine articles, lots of things were published which were misinformed. They were misusing the information that was out there. Now, that's not surprising, because a lot of the research that we'd done was buried in scientific journals. So my motivation in writing the book was to say, okay, these are the facts. So in a readily digestible form, this is what's going on. You can make your own minds up. We are not anti-angling. We're just saying that you should understand the situation. You should understand what the consequences are of treating or handling the fish in these different ways. So I guess what I really hope in terms of the response that the book is going to generate is a better understanding that hey, fish are smart. Fish are interesting creatures. They're vertebrates. They're more interesting and complex than we'd actually ever anticipated. But as the consequence of that, the knock-on consequence of that is that maybe we should think about how we handle them. So maybe coming up with best practice, not pulling fish out of water when we've caught them, but maybe keeping them underwater, which is where they much prefer to be, and taking the hook out if you're going to angle, taking that hook out under the water. And maybe developing underwater cameras so you can see how big that fish was that you caught, but it's underwater, and again, you're not stressing it by both physically handling it and also it being out in the air. So I think there are a number of things that I would like to see encouraged in terms of best practice, in terms of how we handle and manage the fish, whether it's in aquaculture or for sport. And I think the other thing which surprised me as I was writing the book, which I hadn't anticipated, was, of course, if you think about how we interact with fish, we might do it as a sport, we might do it for farming purposes. We catch them out at sea. And I hadn't really given much thought before writing the book about the consequences of what we had been finding in terms of how fish experience the harvesting process out at sea. And that has made me realize subsequently, actually, there's a lot of work we could be doing there. That is not a pretty process. It's very much out of sight, out of mind. We really, how many of us actually know what goes on long lining or trawler boats? It's the processes there can be very long, slow, suffering deaths. And I think given that we now have very good information on what we should be doing within aquaculture to very quickly and humanely kill fish, we should be taking some of those ideas and best practice and potentially seeing if we can actually make those or similar kinds of process available to trawler boats that go out and fish at sea.
Yeah, I think the closest information that most people have is there's the Discovery Channel show, the Deadliest Catch,
Yes.
that shows the drama of being a seaboard fisherman, someone
Yes.
who's out at sea. But it was focused on the drama of the fishermen,
Right.
not the fish.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, the fish are there, and they're not having a very good time of it. But again, this is something else that sort of definitely struck me during the course of writing the book. These issues aren't easy, philosophically, ethically. These are tricky debates that we need to be having, and we haven't really got there yet, I think, in terms of how we need to be thinking about all of this. And that fish at sea, the way we're harvesting it, it probably is having a very miserable death. But you have to somehow equate that with the fact that until that point, it's actually had a free, normal life. It's been living out, in the open,
right.
in its natural habitat, doing its natural thing. Now, that isn't the case, of course, for the fish that we farm, who are in the cages, right, kept at higher densities than normal, fed on processed food, and so on and so forth. So there are some ethical debates that we need to be having as well, I think, which are going to prove very interesting in the next few years, I would say.
I think it's that bringing up the point of the science informing the ethical debates that we need to be having. So every so often I talk about the importance of how science is a part and should be a part of informing politics and needs to be. And I get backlash from people occasionally who say, no, keep my science and my politics separate. It's not like chocolate and peanut butter. These are separate worlds. They need to be separate. I mean, is it important to you as you become more and more knowledgeable to try and inform more towards policy?
Definitely, and I think that it's important in lots of different ways, because I think that policy should be informed. Absolutely, we shouldn't be second guessing something that we're then producing as legislation. And I think the other thing too is that it's really important that we don't rush in where we don't know. And I think there's been a tendency to do that. And so I think you need to rely on your scientists to actually tell you what we do know. And so I think I don't think you can keep them separate. I think it's actually really essential that you do have one informing the other, and that we use that wise counsel, to make sure that we are making careful, appropriate decisions. And that hasn't, as I say, always been the case, particularly within the welfare world. Actually, there has been a habit to rush in and try and protect, thinking we were doing the right thing, where in fact we actually didn't really understand what we were doing, and in some cases we were potentially making things slightly worse. Now things have improved now, I think, to a large extent there. But I would say that things are at such an infancy with this whole fish welfare area that we need to be very careful in terms of what we're advising and what we're turning into to law in some places. I mean, in Switzerland and Austria, for example, they now have extremely stringent laws associated with angling and about whether you can release after you've caught a fish, or whether you have to take it and kill it straight away. And some of those laws I think have been rushed through, and they haven't necessarily been thought about very carefully, particularly from the perspective of, at the moment, they are forcing us to actually remove the larger fish from the system. But the larger fish are going to be the ones that produce more eggs and offspring. So actually those are the ones that, from a conservation perspective, you want to keep in the system. So, that's kind of what I mean about let's not rush in here. Let's make sure that we've had some balanced, appropriate, sensible debate before we start making things, a law or legal.
Has the response to your book so far, how has it been?
On the whole, pretty good, actually. I've been very pleasantly surprised. It's a little bit mixed. I still have the frustration that I think a number of people see the title, Do Fish Feel Pain, and they guess what's going to be in the book. But I have to say, those who've read it, including a number of angler colleagues and also a number of angling magazines that have read it, have been pretty positive. They see the book as being a fairly balanced piece. I'm not on a soapbox. I'm not trying to suggest this is how we should be doing things. I'm just, as I say, trying to present the facts in a readily digestible manner. And that seems to have gone down well so far. So I've been quite pleased about that.
I'm sure that not having somebody saying fishing's bad, and writing a book with a very biased agenda from the very get-go is probably something that the fishing community, the angling community, is appreciative of.
Yeah.
Just information is welcome, I'm sure. But good luck with sales of the book. I hope it gets out to more people. This has been a really, really interesting conversation. There's so much about fish. I want to know more.
Well, it's been really interesting talking with you, and I appreciate the opportunity and for being invited. Thank you.
You're welcome. One last question. Mm-hmm. Do you fish?
I don't, but my son does. So, okay. Yes.
Just had to ask.
No, that's fine. I don't think I'm really any good at it, to be honest, but yes.
All right. Many thanks to you for joining us, and many thanks to everyone out there for watching the show and joining us here on Dr. Kiki Science Hour. For more information about the fishing, we will put a couple of about Do Fish Feel Pain in the book. We will put links to the Amazon sale website and to Dr. Braithwaite's lab department's website on our website, so you can find more information there. And I'm Dr. Kiki, and this has been the Dr. Kiki Science Hour. Next week, we are going to be talking about... What am I going to be talking about next week? I am completely forgetting, but it's going to be... Hold on. 1 second. Let me see if I can get it. Next week, I don't know. I have no idea. It'll be something interesting, I promise you. In the meantime, you can download more episodes of the Science Hour at www.twit.tv/Kiki. That's Kiki, twit.tv/Kiki. And you can find me online. Just look for Dr. Kiki in Google. I'm all over the place. I'm on Twitter. I have my own website. Just look for Dr. Kiki. If you would like to, also, subscription numbers count. So subscribe to. Don't just watch us live. Don't just watch us on YouTube or the other places. Try and subscribe. We like knowing how many people are subscribing to the show. If you need more sciencey goodness, there is more to come. This Week in Science can be found at twis.org and also on the Twit Network every Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Pacific Time. Additionally, Mondays, we're releasing Green Tech Today, our Twit Network green technology show. So there's lots of green, lots of science, all on the Twit Network. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week. All I ask is 1 hour a week. It's really not that much to make your world a whole heck of a lot more interesting.